It was in a broadcast about Galli-Curci, given many years ago, that I heard a phrase which remained with me. A happy phrase, I think, found, and characteristically found, by Philip Hope Wallace to describe the kind of singing we've heard just now. Like a nightingale singing in its sleep, he said. And that's right. The suggestion of the flow, the sweetness, the sense that singing comes by nature. And there's also something, I think, that knits up the ravelled sleeve of care, dreamily beneficent. Something, at any rate, that's too good to be stopped at the point where I broke into the bell song from Lakme, for that's what it was. Let's listen on for a minute or so more to this old record from 1916. I expect that to younger listeners it must sound prehistoric, and the orchestra, of course, is prehistoric. But if you listen past that and the old surface, straight through to the voice, you won't, I fancy, find it so remote. To me, it's like a living presence, and a delightful one. A nightingale singing in its sleep, yes, even when it's singing words. She's Tennysonian, just as old Tennyson said he wanted to take the hiss out of the language to make it liquid and Italian. So with Galli-Curci, all languages become gentle tongues, all vowels and M's and L's and R's. The moan of doves in immemorial elms and the murmur of innumerable bees. If Tennyson's famous onomatopoeia had been set to music, it should have been sung by Galli-Curci. Yet she wasn't an enervating singer. For one thing, she preserved a full range of vowel sounds. They didn't all round out or close in towards a kind of R, but remained sharply, freshly differentiated. And she sang with spirit, with humour even. And she was not one of those coloratura sopranos who are all very well on the heights, but useless on the stave, where, after all, most of even their notes still lie. Her voice was firmly placed and clearly produced. Hear a verse of the song sung by Solveig in Grieg's Peer Gynt music. It rarely goes above the stave, and never higher than A. But Galli-Curci sings it as a genuine light lyric soprano should, with well-defined tone, even and steady emission, and, of course, a charm and a style that were entirely personal. Of all the many lovely things there, I like the contrast of clean, clear takes of the notes with that rather affectionate lulling portamento, the little curve downwards from one note to another, which doesn't make the singing droopy or, so to speak, soppy, because it isn't overdone. And it's a light vocal gesture, not of self-pitying pathos. That's when in some singers it becomes what we feel like calling droopy, but a gesture like a light caress, a touch of affection. Let's go on for a moment to consider some more sides of Galli-Curci's art, for she was an artist. That is, she did find in music something not only beautiful in itself, and so to be presented with the utmost beauty of sound, but also a means of expression. Of course, she wasn't one of the great dramatic artists of the lyric stage, and I don't think she was an especially subtle interpreter, but there is, or can be, expression in her singing, and an awareness of drama, sometimes movingly so. As you listen to the aria Qui la voce sua soave, sung by Elvira in Bellini's I Puritani, you hear great tenderness, and I don't know whether you'd say depth of character, but at least there's a strong individuality. Once you know Galli-Curci's art at all, you'd never mistake this for a performance by another singer. That was the first part of Galli-Curci's record of Elvira's scene in I Puritani. You may be saying to yourself, if you know modern versions of this, it's very lovely, but what a pity it isn't just a little slower. I think that'd be a just comment. But of course that first part isn't the whole story. They decided when making the record that they'd try to get this and the aria following, the cabaletta, on one side of the 12-inch disc. And there was always, in those days, an eye on the studio clock. It couldn't be allowed to go for more than a few seconds over the 4 minutes at the most. And I've no doubt that with the second part to fit in, there was a strong urge to move the first section forward faster than it would have been taken in the theatre. And then when we come to the second section, Vien diletto, there's rather less sense of hurry, as though they know now that it's going to fit, and the performance is a brilliant one. That second half of the Puritani record reminds us that although we've been talking about a lyric soprano so far, Galli-Curci was famous as what's called a coloratura soprano. She was famous for the scales, the staccatos, the trills, the high notes, and so forth, and no wonder. In that record there are some lovely decorations of the line, and the crowning high note is beautifully swelled and sustained. And there's also the often astonishing breath control. If you followed her breathing in those descending scale passages, you'll probably have been surprised to find how marvellously sustained that is. Try it again in this section of her recording of one of those sets of variations, beloved of coloratura sopranos in those days. Ah, que vous dirais-je, maman? No, it's not surprising, is it, that in an age that made so much more fuss of its singers than we do, she should have become such a very special name, and that in an age which was just discovering the pleasures of having a gramophone or phonograph in the home, her records should have had such a special place in the collection. Her kind of fame is something which is probably hard for us now to realize. It wasn't just that in the opera houses audiences went wild, her fees went up, the curtain calls went on, 60 after one performance in New York, we're told. It wasn't just that the scramble for seats was something that even New York had not seen for some years, and that when she appeared in any part of the world in concerts, there was an excited expectation that made the event, in prospect at least, seem one of the events of the year, or the decade. It was also that in those days a famous singer was more or less a daily figure in the popular press. And it's no exaggeration to say, as her biographer does, that in the years just around the time of Caruso's death, in 1921, she was one of the most famous and talked about women in the world. There's a price to be paid for this, which I'll come to in a minute. But first, let's just briefly trace the steps to this summit. She was a musical girl in a musical family. At the conservatory in Milan, she studied piano, harmony, and composition. The composer Mascagni was a friend of the family, and it was his advice that she should take up singing. She made her debut in Rigoletto in 1906, in a little town called Trani, then to Rome 2 years later, then throughout Italy, though not to La Scala, Egypt, Spain, and Russia, and most notably from 1910 onwards, fairly frequently to South America, where, in Buenos Aires, 1915, she made her only appearance with Caruso. In all of these years, her reputation was steadily growing, and a repertoire too, including, and it always surprises me, Der Rosenkavalier. She was Sophie, and what one would give to have heard her sing Ist ein Traum, or È un sogno, or whatever it would be in Italian, not to mention the soaring phrases of Wie himmlischer nicht irdischer. But the turning point came in 1916, which took her to North America. Here, in Chicago, it was November the 18th, the great Galli-Curci legend had its birth. Then with the Chicago Company in New York, and then, for the opening night of the 1921 season, the first for many years without Caruso, she came to the Metropolitan. And throughout that decade she sang there, though in a limited repertoire, Lucia, Rigoletto, The Barber, Traviata, occasionally Romeo and Juliet and Dinora, and, surprise perhaps, Coq d'Or. Tours throughout Europe, South Africa, Australia, India, the Far East, gramophone records. Those records were a very special household possession, and there must have been some hundreds of thousands of homes where gramophone handles were wound up and steel needles were put into sound boxes which would bear down remorselessly on the crackly surface of the single-sided red label that was the family's pride and joy. And out would come Madame Galli-Curci singing, "Lo, hear the gentle lark." But there is another side to the record, though there wasn't to that one when it was first issued in 1919. The frantic expectations of the public, who'd heard Galli-Curci only through these records, couldn't always be fulfilled in the flesh. There were disappointments. There was also, sadly, a medical problem. For over a long period, a growth had formed in the throat, which eventually was x-rayed in 1935, and a tumour was removed after an operation that could well have put paid to her career. And indeed, essentially, it did, because although she returned to the concert hall and even to the operatic stage at the end of 1936, it was not a happy return, and she retired to her home in California, where she lived quietly till her death in 1963. The throat trouble had certainly affected the reliability of her singing for several years. It was partly that sometime, perhaps in the mid-1920s, the voice lost some of its brilliance, partly that pitch was more uncertain. We can hear this on the later records, not grossly, or so as to cancel the beauty of the sound, but it is noticeable. In, for instance, such an otherwise lovely piece of singing as this from La Traviata, where there's a little flatness on the note F in Sospiro e luce, and then a more unmistakable occurrence on the high note, the A flat. Despite criticisms, however, she could still sing delightfully in the later years, and she still made some charming records. And despite critics who would have liked more significant songs, there's still a special charm, I find, in these old-fashioned songs with flute obbligato, or waltzes like this one of Luigi Arditi's, Parla. "1927 was the date of that recording, and I find it irresistible. I'd like to go back, however, for the final record in this centenary programme, back to the very best days of this famous singer, and back also to the very best of her art. W.J. Henderson, a formidable old New York critic, reckoned that her best role was Rosina in The Barber of Seville. He'd always admired Galli-Curci immensely, and simply thought that it was a pity, as he said, that so richly endowed, cultivated, and gracious a woman should have been heralded as if she were a new breakfast food or a freak in vaudeville. Her cantilena is excellent, he wrote. Her coloratura is continent, well arranged, and executed with perfect grace. The voice itself was of unsurpassed elasticity and of exceptional natural beauty. And the Rosina was not just a pretty piece of scherzando singing, but a genuine impersonation, and by it the lady will perhaps be best remembered. Well, let's remember her. Rosina's aria Una voce poco fa, recorded on the 15th of June, 1917, a performance full of grace and wit, natural beauty, and extraordinary skill.
Mi